Okay, good evening and welcome. Excuse my voice; I'm a little bit hoarse, but forgive me. But welcome to the most recent version of Building the Scottish State with myself, Mr. Mark McNaught, on the 20th of January, 2022. And I have the great pleasure to have with me again, Alf Baird. I hope I don't become overly dependent on his wisdom, but we wanted to discuss, among other things, the offshore wind deal that was recently gone through, also about Scottish sovereignty, and which segues very well into the idea of Scotland being a colony. So first of all, Alf, thank you for being with us as always.
Good evening, Mark. Nice to see you again.
Absolutely. So tell us, I don't have a lot of knowledge about what the offshore wind deal entails, and I know that you're much more knowledgeable about things like sea area and stuff like that. So if you could describe to us what happened and and was it a sellout, as some people are describing it?
Well, the Crown Estate is tendered for in Scotland. And if you look at the map showing where renewables will be placed and are being placed, Scotland is basically being surrounded by wind farms, by enormous amounts of electric capacity, many times greater than Scotland could ever consume itself. So it's enormous capacity, and it's largely directed at supplying England and the rest of the UK rather than Scotland. So these wind farms are coming into Scotland, but they're basically exporting electricity to the rest of the UK. And they could, if we were as astute as Norway, we'd be putting cables across the North Sea into the continent and supplying the continent with our renewable electricity as well. The problem arises in that we don't recover enough from this asset in the sense of royalties. And royalties are a very common feature of energy supply industry globally. But there's a massive difference between the royalties the UK charges energy companies and, say, what Norway charges, whether that's oil and gas or renewables, and other countries as well. So if you look at published information on royalties, you'll see that Scotland really doesn't play that game, and it's largely because we don't have sovereignty. We don't have sovereignty over our resources. So we're going to be producing through concession with international companies enormous capacity of energy, which will be exported from Scotland, but we will get no real benefit from it.
Okay, and was it a Scottish government decision? I mean, presumably because Scotland's still part of the UK, of course, that it would be a Westminster decision. But as I understand, the Crown Estates were devolved to Holyrood, or I'm not exactly sure what that means.
Well,
but
it's the Crown Estate is a government agency. It was previously not under the jurisdiction of the Scottish government, but some of its activities came under the jurisdiction of the Scottish government, in the sense that Scottish ministers have some powers of appointment and so on. But my view on the matter. Scotland within the UK is not a sovereign state. The Scottish government is a department of Westminster. So all its institutions are basically part of that department of Westminster. It's a spending department of Westminster. It's not an independent sovereign parliament. Its civil service is still drawn from the UK civil service, the British civil service. So its directives and policy, and of course energy policy is reserved, and energy regulation is entirely reserved to Westminster. There's not really the only thing that's devolved, if you like, to Scotland is planning permission, which is essentially a local government function to some extent, because it's just like planning a house. You apply to your local council for planning consent. So Scotland really doesn't have any control over this. The decisions are really made outside Scotland. Ministers may wave plaudits or applaud some success for money coming in, but essentially we're not playing in the royalty business, so we're not able then to develop things like sovereign wealth funds from our resources. Our resources, going back to the colonial nature of Scotland,
which we'll get into later. Yeah,
I can't avoid it. Sorry, this is a classic example because colonialism fundamentally is about economic exploitation.
Yeah.
We think of colonialism in many different other areas as well, culture, linguistic, political control, but essentially it's about economic exploitation. And we've seen it happen with oil and gas. We've seen it happen with other resources. Aggregates is another one. Now we're going to see it with masses of renewable energy, which will be exported from Scotland at low cost. It will be exported cheap, on the cheap. So Scotland basically becomes and is a cash cow. And this is enormous loss of value. Scotland could easily have enormous possibilities of wealth, but it's extracted. In economic terms, it's interception of economic rents. It's actually, in colonialism terms, it's just basically theft.
Yeah,
it's robbery.
Pillage, plunder, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, plunder. That's what colonialism is. It's plunder. And it's all under the guise of a union. But of course, we know that Britain entered into many treaties with many, many colonies, and pretty much all of them were violated. We saw recently the treaty with the European Union violated within a very short period. This is a normal process. People in Scotland think they have a treaty of union, but it doesn't really exist in practice.
Yeah. Same with the Americans and their treaties with the Indians, especially in the 19th century. They would go, they would go in and massacre a few, say sign a treaty. Okay, you can stay there, and then they go in there and drive them out.
Yeah, anyway. Exactly. And a lot of these treaties, in, for example, Canada, are now going through the courts. Yeah. Because all these treaty violations are violations in law. So Scotland's plunder, the plunder of Scotland, is just continuing. The tragedy really is we have a nationalist administration in Edinburgh, which is facilitating this. And we also have majorities, massive majorities of nationalist politicians in Westminster representing Scotland and sitting doing nothing. They're just sitting looking at the plunder of Scotland. Now, this is a big problem because you could easily calculate that Scotland at the moment, through all its assets, is being plundered for a certain amount of money every year. And if you put all the industries together and all the utilities that have been sold off to private equity funds, and that's everything, ports, airports, energy companies, you name it, they've all been sold off. Oil and gas is stripped out. Energy now is going. You could easily say this is 40, 50 billion pounds a year coming from this economy. People have recently said that this particular round of renewables contracts would be worth 5 billion a year to an independent Scotland. Just these renewable contracts alone. Now, we're going to see a lot more renewable contracts around Scotland for wind farms. So that's going to be equally a fantastic loss of resource, of asset value, which just through loss of sovereignty. So Scotland is being fleeced enormously because its politicians are unwilling to act and to protect sovereignty, but to critically prevent this kind of interception of our asset values, which is enormous and is weakening the economy. Think for it also what we could have done with low-cost energy for our people. I mean, if we're exporting 90% or more of this production, as we did with oil and gas, and we still do with oil and gas, we export 90%, but we earn very little or nothing from it. We could have been creating ourselves a very, very low-cost energy economy. And that could have been fueling production of all different kinds of goods, manufactured goods and so on, using low-cost energy or zero-cost energy. We could have been a very competitive economy in Europe and globally. So this is the opportunity cost. It's not just about the money and value that's stripped out of Scotland as a cash cow. It's about the opportunity cost of what we could have done to build our economy, to build our economic strength, and what we could have done with that for our people.
Okay, agreed. And that very nicely gets on to the next point. And if you, for those viewers who may have watched the TNT show with John Drummond, fascinating discussion between John and Chris Hanlon Chris had recently proposed the Devo Max option on the for another referendum. To be fair, he is much more supportive of course he wants full independence, and he was saying that in a context of we want the Scots to have the most choice possible. But they did get into a really interesting conversation about sovereignty, which almost got close to heated at points. But the basic contention, that as I understood it, was that that Chris was advocating that Scotland got independence in 1320 with the Declaration of Arbroath. It was reaffirmed several times in the Claim of Right of 1689, and several times since, and as recently as 2018. And so there's this notion of Scots having sovereignty, and that is supported lightly in law, I guess you could say. And John was making the point, which I was more sympathetic to his point, was that if Westminster wants to shut down the Parliament tomorrow, the Scottish Parliament tomorrow, they can. Their notion of parliamentary sovereignty is such that they can completely ignore Scottish sovereignty completely, and so it's a Scottish sovereignty is a belief, but it's not it's not grounded in law, at least UK law, and of course Scotland is part of the UK, so they're subject to that. How do you see this notion of Scottish sovereignty?
Well, it's not a particularly strange relationship when you look at the post-colonial literature. Britain had treaties with all its colonies. It violated most of them. Look at the treaty recently with the European Union on Brexit, violated already. So it's very naive for anybody in Scotland to believe that we have a treaty which provides a union of any equal nature. It's never been a treaty of equals. It's always been a treaty which enabled Scotland to be plundered and exploited economically and in other ways. So you could tear up the treaty. It doesn't really mean a damn. It's like all of Britain's treaties, as you said, Britain's treaties with the American Indians, with the Canadian Indians. Some of these cases are now coming back to court because of the violations and the injustices leveled on Indigenous people. So the treaty is, although it exists, the fact is that Scotland, although the Scots believe we're sovereign and we believe we're sovereign, our politicians won't assert sovereignty. We elect majorities of nationalist politicians that don't believe they can assert sovereignty. So they don't believe they can assert sovereignty, or they're not prepared to do so. Our sovereignty is not respected either by the partner in the union, which is England, or our own politicians. So the people then have to figure this out. Who is going to assert sovereignty? If the politicians don't do it, and if our partner in the union don't respect our sovereignty, the people themselves must do something about it. And that's essentially what we have to do at upcoming elections, is to sort this mess out, because it cannot continue. Colonial literature tells you what happens eventually with the people that are subject to these kind of injustices and exploitation. Eventually, the people just perish. The people and nation perish. They're subsumed into a greater imperial power, and that's essentially what's been happening in the so-called Union since 1707, if not before. Scotland is simply being subsumed. It has been culturally, linguistically, politically, and economically. It's just been plundered totally. We have nothing to show for our assets, absolutely nothing.
Yeah, and also he's making the point that with regard to sovereignty, that again that Scotland doesn't have a de facto sovereignty. There's this idea of sovereignty, but in what ways do you? And you say, I think, obviously justifiably, that the politicians, whether it be in Holyrood or in Westminster, are not asserting sovereignty. In what ways do you think they should do that? I mean, if you were Ian Blackford, imagine for a minute,
the breaches of the Treaty of Union are endless. But the fact remains, if we believe we're sovereign, we're told we're sovereign, and the claim of right exists as well, for Scotland to as a sovereign people, then this needs to be asserted. There's majorities of nationalist politicians have been elected now 3 times at Westminster, 3 majorities, and they've just taken their seats and done nothing about it. So essentially, I think we are back to the situation we were in pre-devolution, where it was widely accepted politically by both sides that a majority of nationalist politicians could withdraw Scotland from the Treaty of Union. And that needs to be undertaken. If it's not undertaken, I don't see any other option than going through the UN decolonisation process, which is a committee called C24. And the UN's Committee on Decolonisation is committed to independence for non-self-governing territories. So Scotland, I've been in touch with that committee before, and what's required initially is for Scotland to be listed for decolonisation. Now, if Scotland's sovereignty is not respected by either its own politicians or by its partner in the Union, it doesn't really have much of a choice other than to go for decolonisation. And that, if anything, that would show the reality that there is no union. There's no unionists in this situation. There's just economic plunder and political and cultural control of a people, which the UN describe as a scourge, a punishment which should be ended. And that's why the UN Committee on Decolonisation in that context is regarded as independence. So when we talk about independence, we must always get back to this issue about what people actually mean by independence. And also, Scots need to understand why they want independence. It's not just a change of government, it's a complete change of cultural and political control of a people, and this propensity to plunder an economy. So we have to...
I've had a request for you to teach me how to pronounce Buccleuch or Buccleuch or whatever it is. So,
the Duke of Buccleuch. Well, all I know about the Duke of Buccleuch is one of the biggest landowners.
Buccleuch.
If you just say Buccleuch.
Buccleuch. Okay, all right.
Buccleuch.
Thank you, Jock, for the question. I know that I pronounced it, but I know I mispronounced it, but I didn't know how badly. So thank you, Jock Gibbs, for evoking that.
Yeah, so I'm not sure where we're at, but essentially, I think we could go through all Scotland's resources. Whether it's oil and gas, aggregates, whiskey, landed estates. There's a lot of estates in Scotland that are just. But they're also owned by offshore private equity groups and so on, or interest. Scotland has basically just been sold to international money men. We have no transparency really about a lot of this, because a lot of the companies that own assets and investments in Scotland are offshore. And that's a feature that we just have no control over our economy. And Robin McAlpine has written some very interesting articles recently about the decline of Scottish corporations. Scotland lost pretty much most of its industrial activities and also its service industries as well, its banking sector. All these companies have been acquired by mostly London stock market interests and others. There's been no protections against these corporations to grow in Scotland. Whereas in other countries, there's protections. We don't have protections, for example, in minimum requirements for offshore, for international ownership. A lot of countries, you have to have a local partner to do investments, a local company. So we're not really in a position to tax corporate profits from activities in Scotland. We need to do that as an independent country. We need to completely change the way that we think about Scotland. But first and foremost, we need to understand what colonialism does to a people, to an economy. And let's remember as well that half or close to half of people in Scotland live in or close to poverty. Enormous amounts of people, more than a third apparently, according to reports today, are in debt. There's enormous misfortune within Scotland, largely due to this dysfunctional nature of political management of Scotland. So in colonialism, the gains taken out of the country are usually considered to be equivalent to what the nation could have done with that. So pretty much all are things like inequality, poverty, deprivation. These are all functions of colonialism. These are not due to policies necessarily. These are about oppression and about exploitation. So pretty much all are negative aspects of our economy. It's pretty much why a lot of areas of Scotland look a bit like Murmansk rather than Molde in mid-Norway. We don't use our assets. We don't get the benefit from the wealth that our nation produces.
Yeah, because you don't have because
Scotland doesn't have extracted.
Because there's no control over it. It's still under the control.
Well, this is sovereignty at the end of the day. Sovereignty ultimately is control of your borders.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to get back onto this notion of sovereignty because I've taught American history for many years, and I've always been fascinated by this ridiculous, preposterous notion of Westminster sovereignty. And maybe it's evolved over the years. I don't know. But basically, maybe in medieval and later times, God said, that the King of England is the King of England or the Queen, whatever, and that they can do whatever the hell they want to. If they want to say that you can go on the other side of the ocean and God and the Queen will give you this land. It's yours and you can exploit it, do whatever you want to. And, if you look in the colonial charters, for example, there's the Avalon Project from Yale University, which has some excellent documents, and including all of the colonial charters, from, Virginia, Massachusetts Bay, Maryland, etc. And they all proclaim, okay, we're, the God and the Queen or King give this land between these two, latitudinal lines, this land, and it's their obligation to spread the Christian faith. They can have it. They can do what they want to with it, even though it's on the other side of the ocean. And it's just mind-boggling the arrogance of this notion of of parliamentary sovereignty or a divine right, whatever, that they can just that they can justify religiously giving this land on the other side of the ocean to these colonists who form a colony or a company or whatever and try to make money but it's still extant in the sense that there's still this notion that Parliament can do what it wants, and this notion of this is what I want to get back into a little bit about that dialectic between Chris Hanlon and John Drummond last night. Whereas Chris Hanlon was saying, well, we got the Treaty of Union, they have to respect it. And John was saying, well, they don't. And there's no, and I'm adding a little bit to this, but there's no legal mechanism, at least in the UK, to make sure that the UK does abide by this, by the treaties. And their notion of sovereignty means it doesn't matter at the end of the day. I mean, is that the way you see it?
Well, I think you're talking about land, the taking of land in other countries, but we can say the same thing about Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. I mean, Ireland was controlled by, I think, most of Ireland was controlled by 6 English aristocratic families at one time. A lot of the land in Scotland, certainly after the 1745-6 rebellion, a lot of that land, Jacobite land, was confiscated. Yeah,
I think the Carolinas were like 7 lords proprietor, something like that. Yeah, I mean, but a limited number, but I mean,
all that was done was what was done within the UK was done globally. Yeah. But we still have a legacy of this in Scotland. You mentioned the Duke of Buccleuch. Remember that Scotland has probably the most concentrated land ownership in Europe. Yeah. Much of Scotland is owned by 300 or 400 individuals. A lot of them not Scots. Scots' assets are simply traded off as asset plays, whether it's grouse estates, deer estates, all the rest of it. A lot of the land is not used properly as it could be for the people. If you compare Scotland with, say, Norway, again, we're always comparing with Norway. But Norway has the hut culture, where a lot of people in the cities have a wee hut, which means a log cabin in the mountains, and they can get away to these things at the weekend and have a good quality of life and enhances well-being and everything. The Scots have nothing like that. You have agencies like the RSPB turning massive estates into just for the birds. People are not wanted, but and a lot of the glens, as you know, and Straths were cleared of people. Whole villages were cleared and moved out.
I know. Just very quickly, I saw your wife's article in the Yours for Scotland,
yes.
and it was an excellent article. Go to Yours for Scotland and read it. Well recommended. But I just remember seeing that map of the Highland clearances, and I was like, oh my God! All over Scotland, just people wiped away.
It wasn't just the Highlands.
Sent off to Australia or the United States or Canada, or whatever, just expelled. I mean, like the Nakba in Israel and for the Palestinians in 1948 kind of thing.
Remember, Mark, that this didn't happen naturally. This was British government policy. was also to move people out of Scotland. And the British government enacted policies and mechanisms and funding schemes to help subsidise the removal of Scots from Scotland. Now, the only reason that can be is in colonialism, that's called banishment of the natives. And although we look at it through rose-tinted glasses nowadays and say, oh, these Scots developed a great life for themselves in Adelaide, in Auckland, in Los Angeles, wherever. But the fact is they were kicked out or incentivized to get out.
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot because
in colonialism, it's also about plantation, unfortunately. And the British government was very good at plantation, as we know in Ireland.
Yeah,
and we can see the result of that. And it was also very good at dividing territories, including Ireland, for example. But it didn't stop there. We can see it also with India, Pakistan, with Cyprus, with various other places. And of course, the Middle East was basically carved up with straight lines.
Yeah, no Sykes-Picot after the First World War.
Had no respect for cultures, for 1,000-year-old cultures, for 3,000-year-old cultures.
Yeah, the Kurds got majorly screwed.
Exactly. So what's happened in the Middle East, and you can look at Palestine and Israel as well. What's happened in the Middle East is largely a legacy of imperialism. But the legacy we have in Scotland is not a vast difference to it. This country was cleared. It was also planted to some extent and still is. Its culture was destroyed. Its cultures were destroyed. Remember, the government still don't teach the Scots language to its people. There's 2 million people almost in Scotland still speak Scots, but that is gradually diminishing, and that's what gives you your identity.
I never realized that. That whole because as an American, I think I visited Scotland in 77, 81, and I think okay, Scots are just they speak English with a Scottish accent. But then you spend time there and you're saying, wow, what are they saying? No gone day, or going doing the hoose or whatever.
It's a whole different language.
I know. And teaching language.
The problem is the bairns that go into school are turned into wee Anglophones. They don't get their own culture and language. And the reason for that's a common theme in imperialism, colonialism. It's a common theme is language deprivation, to make the natives have the same culture of the colonial elite. And that's what colonialism is.
Well, it's same, but on a lower level, I think, you're Anglophone, but you're not the same Anglophone as Jacob Rees-Mogg or something like that.
If you look at the situation in Quebec, you have the Anglophone Francophone divide.
Yeah.
It's a linguistic divide. You see the same in Ireland now between Irish and basically Scots, as it were, in Northern Ireland. But you see the same linguistic divide. And peoples in self-determination conflict are always linguistically and therefore culturally divided. The difference in Quebec is that the French language has statutory authority, as well as the English language. Okay? The Scots language has no statutory authority and is regarded as educationalists, British educationalists, as invalid. It's an invalid language. That's how they used to describe it and call it something like the verbal deficit, something or other. But it wasn't regarded as a valid language. So the problem here is that language is what determines our identity. And that's the way we vote on the Constitution, largely. It's about British and Scottish identities. So the cultural imperialism is about removing the indigenous identities. We know this. That's what the theory tells us. That's what global practice tells us. It's nothing new. It's just the Scots haven't quite figured this out yet. They need to figure it out. Well, and once they figure it out, they'll ken it fine.
It's only in the last several months that I would have understood exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. But well, anyway. This is a tragedy because
why do you think many Scots haven't understood that? And what does it take to convince them of that? Apart from shows like what we're doing right now, I mean,
with imperialism, colonialism, the indigenous people are basically conditioned in a sense to denigrate their own culture and language. We call this the Scottish cultural cringe. So when people speak Scots and say polite company, they're reprimanded. So Scottish children, Scots bairns going into the school, if they spoke certain Scots words like aye or no, yes or no, they would be reprimanded.
I know. I was amazed to learn that because for example, in the United States, when they take a Senate vote, it's either aye or nay. It's Scottish.
Exactly.
But then I learned that if you're in a Scottish school and you say aye, that's wrong.
Yeah, well, what? Yeah. If you said to an English teacher things like "ma hoose" or "ma heed" or "ma trousers" or "ma breeks," you might be reprimanded. But these are actually bona fide Scots words from the Scots language. Yeah. So, in any other country, certainly Northern Europe, you get the kids are taught English plus they're taught the indigenous language. Whether that's the Netherlands, Finland, Norway. They're taught both, but the reason they're taught both is it's the only way that people remain distinctive in a sense. If you want diversity of people, you need to protect their cultures. And in fact, the European Council has reprimanded Scottish and British governments several times for not teaching the Scots language. Because the Scots are, in a British context, the Scots are a minority people. They have a minority language. Within the UK context, there are minority indigenous people within Scotland, and they're described that way by the European Council, which is not the European Commission. But the UK government and the Scottish government have for many, many years, well, they've never agreed to teach Scots in the schools. The reason why they don't is because it's politically too dangerous.
Why do you think that is? What is so? I mean, I live in Brittany. And Breton is a language, and it has been. And as for what I understand, Breton was the most spoken Celtic language before, or Celtic. I'm not sure what the proper pronunciation is. Before the Second World War, it was even more than Welsh. And then after that, the French government came in and just pretty much wiped it out. They were you can't, and it's barely hanging on right now. You have people that speak Breton and all that, but so Brittany as an identity is still there, and there is an independence movement and all that, but it's hard. I've worked with some of the Bretons here. It's a very uphill struggle, and but the Scots have, I think, but just the idea of it being recognized as a language and a valid language, I'm not sure what I'm asking, but what is your view on that? Sorry.
Well, I said the reason it's not taught is political. The reason it's not taught is political. Is because the British government imperial powers know that language is what tends to it gives people their identity, the national consciousness, together with their culture. National consciousness gives them their identity. Without the language and culture and the national consciousness, there's no drive for independence. That is what is actually the fundamental driver of solidarity for independence is the combination of identity based on Scots language and culture. Without these, there would be no desire for Scottish nationhood. So we have to understand the colonial power the imperial power will always try and suppress indigenous language, because that's the way it manages to control the society that it's basically taken over or incorporated, as you say, through the union. So it's incorporated Scotland, but to incorporate the people thoroughly, it has to change their culture. The BBC is a classic example. The stereotypes as well. What happens is the indigenous.
Just very quickly on that.
People,
I mean, just very quickly on that. I mean, the only
internalize the stereotypes given to them.
Exactly,
and that changes into what's known as something else. It's known as appropriated racial oppression.
Exactly, and the only thing I've known about that, I've seen I don't watch the BBC or British TV regularly, but the only images that I have are like Ramsay Nesbitt, and there was some other TV show that was really stupid. Just show these Glaswegians, oh, let's get drunk, let's do this, but I mean, just no depth whatsoever, just stupid stereotypes.
Well, this is it. The imperial power controls the media, and through that, it portrays these stereotypes of the native as being helpless, hopeless, has to be protected through a protectorate state kind of mechanism. And of course, on the other hand, it portrays on the other side, I wouldn't say the colonizer, but it portrays the elite hegemony, which is Anglophone in our case, as astute, sensible, intellectual, of high status. You understand?
Yeah.
So it portrays all that side as being there. They have a right to govern because they're intellectual, they're sensible, they have high status, and so on. And the poor native is basically driven into the ground of worthless nature, a worthless language, a worthless culture, and then is devoid of opportunity. What this is, though, is sociolinguistic prejudice. And we see it throughout institutions, because, as I said to you before, I think, with colonialism, all your institutions are colonial in nature. They have a hegemony, which is, in our case, Anglophone, and a different culture. You have, in colonialism, you have a kind of what Fanon called a Manichaeism. You have these two psychic cultural realms that people try to live within. So the Scots native is living within two psychical realms of culture. And the only way to get on in socioeconomic terms is to embrace the culture of the imperial power, the colonizer. You have to speak proper English. You have to take the values as well.
That's my dad. That's my dad.
You have to assume a new persona.
Exactly. I mean, that's
and this is where we get into.
My father was born in Govan in 1937, sons of big engineering family, in the shipyards, and he, I talked to my uncle more recently, and all of a sudden he wanted to become an Anglican minister. And it became totally out of the blue. And he ended up going to Oxford. He went to Wells Theological College. He was a very successful minister, a lovely man. I mean, just, the light of my life. I mean, he was the best father ever. But he was very Anglophone, I mean, and the people, I remember going to his funeral, his memorial service. And an English woman, this was in Baltimore, Maryland, and an English woman got up and said, "Oh, well, I really liked, Matthew's sermons because they were English, But I knew he was Scots, but he took on that persona. He went to Oxford, he went to Wells, and he was very successful in it, even though his ideas were much more Glaswegian, Clydeside, etc. But if he wanted to make it in the world, he had to be English.
Yeah, but this, going back to the colonialism theory literature, it tells you that the bourgeoisie embrace the culture of the colonizer. They embrace it. They discard and cast off their own culture and language, and they regard their own people as inferior.
I wouldn't say that about my father, but
cultural. We get into the realms then of cultural and colonial assimilation.
Yeah.
So the native bourgeoisie and others try to embrace that culture. They change their persona and they discard their own culture and people and language and leave that behind. The problem is a lot of the people, the natives, can't do that.
Yeah.
And didn't want to do that. I didn't want to cast off my culture.
Okay.
It's the only thing that gives me diversity.
Yeah, I do want to get onto questions, but I just wanted to kind of wrap up a little bit about both your perception of Scottish sovereignty and also about colonization, just to cap it off before we go on to the questions. So how do you see this with regard to sovereignty, the tension between the Westminster notion of Crown and Parliament sovereignty relative to the Scottish notion of more popular sovereignty? And does under the current conditions, as Scotland is a member of, is still part of the UK, does Scottish sovereignty mean anything, or is it legally, or is it just a belief?
Well, the more this debate continues, the more I get the feeling that Scottish judges would like to look at this at some point, because within the treaty that the Scottish judiciary was enshrined within the treaty and the Acts of Union. So Scots law, as it's generally termed, is protected within that. Scots sovereignty, we know from history, is distinctly different from the English notion of parliamentary sovereignty, whereas we have what people sometimes describe as popular sovereignty, where the people are sovereign. The question really remains is how that sovereignty may be asserted. And we've known in the past, in the very recent past, that political sovereignty of Scotland is in the hands of its members of parliament. And various prime ministers, even quite recently, certainly John Major as being probably the most recent one, confirmed that Scottish sovereignty was basically in the hands of Scotland's members of parliament, a majority of whom could assert sovereignty either by withdrawing Scotland from the treaty or even maybe trying to enter into negotiating a new treaty. And that's another option that's not really been considered very much.
When do you think, because that was the SNP policy, back in what do you think happened? Why was that dropped? The idea that, even the Margaret Thatcher reported that if there was, let me just finish just so that our viewers understand that if there was a majority of SNP or nationalist, pro-independence MPs elected to Parliament, that would constitute a mandate for independence. And that was the SNP policy, at least back in the late 1990s, as far as I understand. Yeah. And if that was applied now, they could have asserted mandates in the last three elections, certainly since the referendum. So do you have any idea what changed with the SNP policy?
Well, the theory that I have is basically it's based on the post-colonial template.
Yeah.
So
always post-colonialism.
The post-colonial template tells us how this plays out.
Yeah.
First of all, the people, of course, are motivated to get behind one major national party, which is the SNP. And the people have put their faith in that party. So it becomes a dominant national party. But what happens, it becomes aligned with the colonial power very closely. And arrangements are made with the colonial power to take the independence movement so far, but then to push it metaphorically up a blind alley. It pushes it up a blind alley. And the way it does this, or the reason it does this, of course, is because the politicians by this time are enjoying a lucrative lifestyle, big salaries, lots of their friends are in the same
slippers,
group. And they're building up their pension pots. In Fannon's words, they're feathering their nest. Yeah. They're also incredibly afraid of the colonizers' aeroplanes and tanks.
Yeah.
If you get the meaning.
Yeah.
And they don't want to bring or to get close to that inevitable day where they have to make the decision to break free, as it were. Mm-hmm. And that is the big issue that they have ran away from. So they make this colonialism accommodation with colonial power. They feather their nests. They then take the independence movement up a blind alley. And in the same way, they introduce a whole range of what the post-colonial literature describes as mystification policies.
Okay.
Which divert the people onto a whole range of other different nonsensical and useless initiatives.
Can you give a couple examples from other countries? I mean, India. I mean, South Africa. I mean,
the examples
Ireland,
I'm giving you.
I'm sure there's plenty of examples, but if you can give
the examples I'm giving you are from the likes of Tunisia, Algeria, Kenya.
Okay.
And to some extent, Ireland. Ireland is a very good example where you had a dominant national party up to the point of the Eastern Rising.
Just to be clear, you're not only speaking about post-colonial from the British, but from Algeria, from the French, and okay. Just to be clear, okay.
Well, colonialism affects many people, so whether it's
most of the planet,
Soviet Union, or the Union of Yugoslavia, or the Union of the French colonies. France had enormous number of colonies.
I know,
and still do. They have some. New Caledonia, for example.
Yeah, we call them the dom-toms, the domicile d'outre-mer, but they're colonies.
Yeah, well, I used to be a ship agent for ships going to the French Caribbean, Guadeloupe and Martinique.
Yes.
So sending cargo out to the European Union Caribbean islands and also Reunion Islands.
They're technically part of France, and they're. I've known people who are doctors and go there and work because they get paid double what they would get paid in France. So there's incentive for them to do
quite a lot of the post-colonial literature comes out of the French writers.
Okay.
Aimé Césaire and Fanon. Césaire and Fanon were both from Martinique. Fanon was a psychologist who went to Paris and then worked during the Algerian Revolution. Mm-hmm. Albert Memmi was of Jewish origin and lived in Tunisia. And his work is possibly one of the best on colonization. So these writers and others were very influential. Within the UK context, we also have the theory of internal colonialism by Professor Michael Hechter, an American academic who studied social aspects of colonialism across many places, including the US, the United States, and internalized racism and other aspects to do with that. So his work in the UK internal colonialism model, which he described as Scotland and the Celtic periphery, Ireland, Wales as well, as having very narrow industrial specialization. The economies were largely set up to serve the core nation.
Yeah. Well, in Scotland's case, shipbuilding.
Yeah. Engineering, mining, and so on. So the economy was basically there to supply the core nation. It had a very narrow industrial specialization. This meant it was subject to severe economic shocks. It also had these economies on the Celtic periphery had a much lower GDP than the core nation. And also throughout much of history in industrial times, lower average wages and much higher long-term unemployment, which also resulted in the outmigration from Ireland and also Scotland and Wales to some extent. So in addition to these factors, he identified a very strong, what he called a cultural and even an ethnic division of labor, which again, with the Anglophone hegemony running society, its institutions, its industrial structures, its corporations, its public bodies and governance, and the indigenous peoples marginalized and given lesser roles, lesser wages, lesser jobs, lesser opportunities, And to some extent, we're still in the midst of some of that legacy with our poverty and our deprivation and attainment as well. Educational attainment. We have educational attainment initiatives which don't even understand that if people are deprived of their own indigenous language.
Yeah. Okay. I want to go on forever, but I do want to get in the remaining 10 minutes or so. I do want to get onto some of the questions.
Okay.
First of all, over the franchise, and we've talked about this before, but we're both members of the SSRG. We have our own view of how Scotland should become independent, but there should be some type of, vote, in the future as to whether, Scotland should become independent or in whatever means. But I know, talking to you, you've had, reservations about the franchise as it would be, because it would be based on, as it was in 2014, on the local franchise. And that anybody that can vote for the city councillor can vote for independence. And myself living in France, I was able to vote before Brexit. I was, as a UK citizen, I was able to vote in the local elections and in the European elections, but I was not able to vote in the presidential or the parliamentary elections because that was reserved for French citizens. And so I know you're thinking on this, but and in addition to your thinking, what mechanisms do you think could be employed in any kind of confirmatory referendum, whatever it be? And I know you mentioned the New Caledonia model that was approved by the UN, but just go on about the franchise and how that should be addressed.
Yeah, well, the franchise, the local government franchise, was established for Holyrood when Holyrood was established, and it reflects the fact that Holyrood is not a sovereign parliament. It has the equivalence of basically a local or metropolitan authority. So it has this local government franchise, which basically means any resident in Scotland can more or less vote on Scottish sovereignty. The problem with that is the demographics of Scotland are continually changing. Scotland doesn't have sovereignty, so it doesn't control its borders. It doesn't control its population. Its population is out with Scotland's control. And the census tells us that there is significant in-migration from the rest of the UK. The issue with that is people from the rest of the UK have the highest propensity to vote against independence. We have to think about this again in the context of the constitutional question is a matter of really national identity, first and foremost, which is based on culture and language, national consciousness. And people that don't have a Scottish culture, a Scots language, a Scots consciousness, a Scots national feeling of identity tend to vote against independence, mostly. And previous surveys on that showed it could be as high as 70, 75%, maybe more. So that's a major issue when the population is continually changing. We also know from the demographics that Scotland's birth rate is the lowest it's been since records began. So the population is only growing now through in-migration, and Scotland has no controls over that. In-migration leads to a range of other issues as well, which people have identified, including inflated property prices in very many parts of Scotland, where local people can't buy the properties because people from outside Scotland are bidding higher on the prices. And people from outside Scotland coming into Scotland tend to be, or historically, the census tells us, it tends to be mostly from the professional managerial class, as it were, who tend to have some wealth, but also tend to also have more conservative views. So not only do they tend to vote against independence, they're also acquiring significant aspects of property, land in Scotland, which Scots are unable to afford. Indigenous people.
Quickly, because we're limited in time. You mentioned before the New Caledonia model,
the franchise,
or determining franchise. If you could briefly explain what that would mean, and
the revised franchise there for the recent election referendum, which didn't go very well as far as I recall, had what's called secondary criteria, And that secondary criteria included a condition that people, in order to vote, had to be resident for at least a certain period, whether it's 10, 15, 20 years, whatever. They had to be resident for a period. This also reflects the fact that national referendums in other countries tend to be reserved only for nationals of the country concerned. The difficulty we have in Scotland is defining who the nationals are.
Yeah.
Now, we'd have to define the nationals in an independent Scotland because fundamentally the role of government in an independent country is first and foremost to protect its sovereignty. And this is where our government isn't able, the Scottish government as a sense, to protect Scotland's sovereignty because it's not a sovereign body. So we really needed to define who the nationals were, and also about issues to do with self-determination. We don't really understand what self-determination means, and the UN stresses quite a lot of importance on the definition of a people, because self-determination is about a people, not just a place. It's not just about the place. The place might not exist, in fact. It's self-determination is of a people.
Okay.
And in this case, it's the Scots people. And therefore, you have to define who are the Scots people. Normally, a people are defined by aspects such as a common heritage, a common culture, a common language, a common ethnicity, actually, and also a common sense of belonging to a nation, and also a common sense of suffering. In our case,
often
exploitation and banishment of pretty much 3 to 4 million.
Catalans are a perfect example. Just very quickly, I wanted to get onto a couple more points before we say goodbye to our viewers.
Okay.
If Scotland were to take this decolonization route through the UN, how could that work, and how long might it take? Or and are there other examples where it has worked, where a country petitions to the UN for the decolonization process? The
reason I wouldn't get too excited about it is the UN has not had a lot of success in the last few years on decolonization. The territories that are left at the moment tend to be smaller territories, even islands that imperial powers want to retain for some reason, militarily, strategically, and so on. And the UN has been unable to make much progress there. But the fact remains that is the international charter that's available to people, is independence through decolonization. And if you're forcibly kept in an arrangement as a retained territory of some kind, or a colony, then you don't really have much other option. The UN would, of course, try to impose some kind of democratic solution, and that could be either be an election or a referendum.
Okay. And finally, not that you can resume it in 2 minutes, but regarding land ownership, and as you correctly pointed out, and Andy Whiteman has written quite a bit about this, the concentration of land ownership in Scotland. Imagine, boom, Scotland's independent tomorrow. How do you see, fundamentally reforming the landowner, the system of land ownership? Because a lot of it is by aristocrats that were, given this land by the Queen, to their bastard son 300 years ago. They have these weird, deeds, of seizing, of seized land, and some of it is on the map, some of it is not like on a physical map, and some of it is like physical descriptions. Just how do it very briefly, I know it takes more than that, but how do you see the system of land ownership changing?
I think we have to get away from Scotland just being used as a global asset play for people with money to come and buy big estates or business piles of land, and often land that they do nothing with. So I think Andy Whiteman's suggestions for things like annual ground rent, and other people suggested some form of regulation and tax would be important. I think also the issue about foreign ownership of land in Scotland has to be looked at, because this is very important in every country. Every sovereign country has regulations on land ownership. Scotland basically has nothing. Because without sovereignty, you can't impose anything like that. So with sovereignty, it has to behave like a serious nation, and protecting its sovereignty and making sure the land is there for the people and the people's benefit, rather than international equity funds to acquire land and just speculate for a period and do very little with it, really. We're sitting on quite a lot of derelict land as well in ports and estuaries, which could be used for different purposes. But offshore private equity groups leave that land derelict until they find a lucrative opportunity for it. So we should be developing that land, and that might require compulsory purchase or other forms of. So there's various mechanisms.
Requisition would be better, but anyway.
Yeah, well, this is it. We've got a lot of port land that I know about that's basically not been used for 30, 40 years. And the owners, the offshore owners, are just waiting on a lucrative opportunity to come along. Whereas we could be using these for social housing purposes, for business development, for reclaiming and revitalizing the waterfront in cities.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, we'll be saying goodbye in just a bit. But is there anything else you'd like to say? Just Alf, as always, has been hitting the nail on the head. Fantastic show tonight. We've got some good accolades. Just if you want to, if you could attempt to send people off on a positive message about Scottish independence.
Well, I shouldn't really be promoting my book again, but Dún Hodden, the social-political determinants,
which I recently learned means held down. I didn't.
Dún Hodden. Well, actually, Dún Hodden means oppressed.
Yeah.
In Scots, the Scots language is so very rich. It's a real tragedy that we're never taught it. But it's our mother tongue, and I remember it from my mother. Or as we say in Scots, my mother.
I only realized it was a language recently. I'd heard about Gaelic or Gaelic or whatever, but I didn't realize the Scots language. And it has its similarities to English, but it's completely different. And it's changed my perspective to say the least. And
Gaelic language is also interesting, but it's
one of the coolest. It's one of the coolest languages ever, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, the Gaelic language is also interesting. That had its own Act of Parliament in 2005, which gave funding and authority to that language.
Yeah. Okay.
But
we a good show.
It's a good show.
All right. Anyway, unless you'd like to say anything else, we'll say goodbye to our.
I think my thrappl's a bit worn out now as well. My thrapple.
I wish I could say it in Scots, but
my thrapple. You've got to say the R.
Thrapple.
Thrapple.
I got a thrapple.
My thrapple's a bit sore.
My thrapple's a bit sore.
Aye.
Cool, man.
You're getting it, Mark.
All right, I'm learning. It's a steep learning curve, but I love it. It's the coolest language ever. Anyway, okay. So stay on, of course, but we'll say goodbye to our viewers, and thank you for all your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everything, but I'm very, we got a lot of positive comments, and it's been a really good show with you as always.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark.